We're talking about kosher, one of the pillars of a Jewish home and of Jewish life. And the word kosher, the more specific meaning of the word is that the food that we're eating is fit for consumption of a Jew. So that's the simple meaning of the word kosher. We'll go into a little bit of a deeper meaning in a few moments. Kosher, sometimes if you want to know how important something Jewish is, you look at the opposition. You look at the anti-Semites. The more they militate against a Jewish practice, you can sometimes conclude that it's because this practice is crucial. It's something very fundamental. And that's why throughout history, there are many accounts of how the anti-Semitic empires tried to impose laws against the Jewish people that banned Sabbath observance that we discussed last week, but also banned keeping kosher. There was a movement in America. It didn't start in America. It started in Nazi Germany to prohibit shechita, the ritual slaughter of animals, under the guise of cruelty, that it's cruel. Believe Germans in 1933 were telling Jews you can't slaughter an animal because it's cruel. The most evil people in the history of the world, equal to Hamas, I would have to say now, are talking about cruelty to animals, but that was reality, and it's spread to the United States. In the United States, there was a major effort against shechita, against ritual slaughter of animals, because it's cruel to the animals. They would club animals with clubs over their heads, but when Jews slaughtered an animal in the most painless way, that was considered cruel. So they tried to ban shechita. They tried to ban. I remember when I was a child growing up, my father was very active in fighting these anti-shechita movements that tried to ban ritual slaughter. And I think in Switzerland to this day you can't slaughter kosher meat. In Belgium they tried to prohibit this. Europe, of all places, the Europe is saturated with Jewish blood. They're worried about the cruelty to animals. But that's reality. That's what anti-Semitism is. They pick on some of our virtues and they turn it into a vice. They take the sins that they commit and accuse us of the same thing, genocide. They are openly asking for genocide of Jews, proudly, and yet they accuse us of doing that. But that's not new. That's the old story that started off with the first Jew in the world who already had opposition. There's a statement in the Mishnah, a very puzzling statement, that the ritual slaughterer, the one who provides for kosher meat, and Amalek, the evil nation, the genocidal evil nation, are partners. What does that mean? You're saying that the shochet, in Jewish tradition, the shochet, the one who did the ritual slaughter, had to be the most conscientious Jew in the community, more than the rabbi. If the shochet was suspected of being a little bit modern, a little bit more permissive in his life, he would lose his job automatically, because has to be the most trustworthy person, the most conscientious person, because if the shochet, while he's slaughtering, makes a little tiny mistake that is impossible to determine, it's only he knows it, it's not kosher. So you have to have implicit trust in the shochet. If the shochet doesn't have that trust, he loses his job. The rabbi could be forgiven if he makes a few mistakes here or there, but the shochet will never be forgiven. At any rate, the shochet of all people, the most conscientious Jew in the community, is a partner of the most vile anti-Semites. What does that mean? Very cryptic words. My grandfather of blessed memory, in one of his books, gives a very beautiful explanation. And he says that what kept the Jews together throughout history were two things. Number one was keeping kosher. Because when they kept kosher, they knew they couldn't socialize with non-Jews who didn't keep kosher. And that kept the Jewish people intact. That kept them from assimilating. Another factor that prevented assimilation was anti-Semitism. That Jews were hated and had to remain separate. So that's what the Mishnah means, that the shochet who provides kosher food and the anti-Semite, the Amalekites, are partners, each in their own way, quite diverse ways, but each in their own way guaranteed Jewish survival and Jewish lack of assimilation. There's a famous Mishnah, a famous passage in the Gemara, rather, that on Purim, that's the next major holiday, Purim, they were supposed to drink to such an extent that you no longer know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And there are hundreds of explanations what exactly that means. I think it has a very powerful meaning. If you look at Haman and Mordechai, they both contributed to the Jewish people's survival. They kept the Jewish people from assimilating. Haman did it through his anti-Semitism, through his hatred of the Jews. And as we're seeing today, that Hamas is contributing very positive things to the Jewish people. It's uniting them. It's making Jews feel more conscientious about Judaism. It's bringing Jews back to the fold by the tens of thousands in Israel in particular and all over the world. So we can't thank them, obviously, but we have to realize that their anti-Semitism is strengthening the Jewish people. If they want to weaken us, this is really causing them to be strengthened. And at the same time, keeping kosher is also the factor that keeps Jews as Jews and prevents them from assimilating. Some people have the notion that if you keep kosher at home, but you don't keep kosher when you eat out, you're a hypocrite. Now, you're not going to get me to say that it's all right to not keep kosher out of the home. I would lose my job if I said that. If I believed it, it would be even worse. No, a Jew has to keep kosher in the home, outside of the home, wherever we go, we have to keep kosher. It's God's commandment. But let's say a Jew says, I'm not ready to keep kosher all the way. I'll keep kosher on Tuesdays. Only on Tuesdays. It's better than not keeping kosher on Tuesday. And Judaism doesn't have everything or nothing. None of us is perfect. We try our best. Today we should be better than we were yesterday. Tomorrow should be better than we are today. We're constantly trying to grow. I heard this on the internet. Someone said a very beautiful point about yesterday's Torah reading. In the very beginning of the Torah reading, Jacob, when he was visited by Joseph, he was laying in bed, he was ill, and he strengthened himself. Vayischazek, he strengthened himself and he sat on the bed. At the end of the parsha, we conclude the book of Genesis. We all declare, Chazak, Chazak, be strong, and we will be strengthened. And everyone stands up. In the reading, prophetic reading, King David tells King Solomon on his deathbed, you shall be strong. And then right after that, you shall go in God's ways. So this commentator pointed out, the first time strengthening is mentioned, Jacob is laying in bed and he sits down. His strengthening himself got him from reclining position to a sitting position. At the end of the parsha, when we declare Chazak, be strong, we're going from a sitting position to a standing position. And the reading, prophetic reading, where King David tells Solomon to be strong, go in his ways. From a standing position, we go to a walking position. We have to constantly get stronger. It doesn't mean that from the very beginning we're laying in bed spiritually and all of a sudden we start walking. First you have to sit down on the bed, then you have to stand up, and then you have to start walking. So keeping kosher is not everything or nothing. And it's not hypocrisy. If it is hypocrisy, it's not keeping kosher outside of the house. But even that's not hypocrisy. That means that we have, as we have spoken many times, we have an animal soul. We have a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination that doesn't give us the strength to do everything we're supposed to do. We win some battles, we lose some battles, and we try to win more of those battles. So if we have the opportunity to keep kosher one day more, one meal more, that is a major accomplishment, and it shouldn't be belittled. And we work on trying to perfect that as well as we do with every other aspect of Judaism. Why do we keep kosher? Because Moses had a PhD in biology and nutrition. He got it from MIT, I believe, Moses Institute of Technology. And he discovered that when you eat pork, you can get trichinosis. And that's why he banned non-kosher food. But as far as we know, MIT didn't yet exist. And Moses probably did not have a PhD, and he probably knew nothing about trichinosis. And you're not making Moses smaller by telling that he didn't know anything about trichinosis. That doesn't make him bigger to know about trichinosis. But it's not because of health reasons. So what is the reason for keeping kosher? The ultimate reason is that it's God's commandment. Even if eating pork would make you healthy, and eating kosher food will make you unhealthy, we would still eat kosher food because God said so. There's a story in the Talmud, a very learned woman whose name was Yalta. She came to the house of study and she asked the rabbis, what kosher food tastes like pork? And they told her it was a certain fish called shibuta that has the same taste as pork. And what cut of meat tastes like a cheeseburger? She didn't say cheeseburger, milk and meat. And they told her the udder of the animal. And she kept on asking these questions as if she's looking for a kosher substitute for non-kosher food. What was she trying to do? Was she such a glutton that she had to have every non-kosher food that she wanted to taste? So the commentators explain she was trying to illustrate a point. We don't keep kosher because there's something inherently distasteful about pork. No. There's a food that's kosher that tastes just like pork, and there's nothing wrong with it. And this has implications for synthesizing meat or eating, what do they call it, artificial shrimp. Fish that's supposed to taste like shrimp. I couldn't tell you if it does or doesn't. But people who have had both say, you could confuse one for the other, perhaps. What is the point the Yalta was trying to make? That it's not because there's something wrong with non-kosher necessarily. I add the word necessarily because there could be something wrong with it. But that's not the reason we keep kosher. We keep kosher because it's God's commandment. And what does the Torah say about keeping kosher? It associates keeping kosher with being holy. Being holy means we're above the fray. We're above the norm. We're not part of the world the way the world exists. We always have to rise above the world. We're always a level above. And the reason why the anti-Semites always condemn us there's a double standard. Part of it is because in truth, they know the truth that we have a higher form of existence because we have the commandments of the Torah. And that elevates us above the natural order. And that's why we keep kosher, to be different, to be holy, to be special. It's also it goes along with it being a discipline. I remember once when I was trying to get the Attica to provide kosher food to the inmates, and we had a whole court case, and it was interesting how the very liberal judge, Curtin, ruled against us. He probably ruled in favor of every lawsuit to favor prisoners, but just to provide them with kosher food, he ruled against us. They do have to provide kosher food, but it doesn't have to be hot food. It doesn't have to match the non-kosher. So I remember telling I think it was the superintendent, I said, if I was in your place, I would mandate kosher food for the Jewish prisoners. You want to give them a discipline. You want these people to be rehabilitated. Well, at least I thought maybe that was what they wanted. That's not what they want, unfortunately. But that's supposedly what the word for prison is what is the term they use for a prison? A rehabilitation or penitentiary, a place where you do penance, where you change your ways. No, that's not what they're interested in, but that's what it's all about. I said I would want them to keep kosher, even if I didn't believe in it, because it gives them a discipline. There's a great Kabbalist, the Rebbe's father, who writes that the word kosher in Hebrew, kasher, is an acronym for 3 words that appear in the book of Psalms. Kimotze shalal rav, like finding a great treasure, an abundant treasure. When you eat kosher, you are acquiring a treasure. What's the treasure? So the Kabbalists tell us that every thing that exists in this world, every physical thing, food in particular, possesses sparks of holiness. And these sparks of holiness are very powerful, and they can affect change in the world. We're always looking to make the world a better place. The way God created it, He wants us to improve on it. And how do we improve on it? By discovering the hidden treasures. It's like, how do we have all the things that we have? We have to mine in the earth and to find the coal, to find the oil, to find the natural gas. All of our energy comes from finding physical treasures in the earth. Well, just like there are physical treasures in the earth, there are spiritual treasures that are embedded in all of the physical things that we engage, in our food in particular. And this spiritual energy, when released, has an impact on the world, and it changes the world, makes the world a holier place, a more godly place, a more peaceful place. So when you eat kosher, how do you extricate, how do you liberate those sparks? The answer is by eating that food that's kosher, eating it with the right intention, that you're eating it to get strength so you could be a better person, a better Jew, and making sure that you thank God for the food before we eat and after we eat. This is how we liberate those sparks. What happens if the food is not kosher? They also have sparks of holiness, but you can't liberate them by eating them. It's like trying to take some poison and use it for yourself. It's going to harm you. The way we liberate the sparks in non-kosher food is by resisting it. Every time you pass a McDonald's, or what's the competition? Burger King, and you are tempted to go in there and buy a cheeseburger, and you say, no, I'm not going to buy it, you liberate those sparks and bring more holiness to yourself and to the world around you. So kosher is kimotze shalal rav. It's like discovering a major treasure. Every time you eat kosher, you are changing the world for the better. This is based on a verse. Man does not live by bread alone, but he lives by the utterance of God. The simple meaning of that is that you don't just live by eating food, you have to have a spiritual life as well. But the great Kabbalist, the Ari, said that what it means is that you don't live by the bread itself, but by the words of God. Those are the sparks of holiness that are embedded in the bread or any other food. That's what gives us life. And that's why we have an appetite, we have a craving for food, because the soul is looking to get that energy that's inside the food and liberate it and allow it to enhance our spirituality and bring more spirituality to the world. What about health reasons? Though I mocked the health reason before, there is some truth. Every myth has some truth. It certainly is not the reason why we keep kosher because it's healthier. You can ask a doctor about eating gribenes. You know what gribenes are? On Passover, they would take chicken fat and fry onions in it and eat it as part of their Passover meal. Cardiologists love that. So you can eat kosher and very unhealthy, and you could eat healthy non-kosher. It's not for the health reasons, but because it is healthy spiritually for us. Everything that works in the spiritual realm has its effects also in the physical realm. So if something is more healthy, more healthful, physically, it would normally translate as being more healthy or healthful in the physical sense as well, although it doesn't give you a license to eat gribbinus or anything like that. It's like many other parts of Judaism. There are a lot of commandments that we do that turn out to be better for our health. For example, circumcision prevents certain types of cancer. For example, going to the mikveh, the hygienic aspects of Judaism are it's said that that's what caused Jews to have fewer casualties during the Black bubonic plague, because Jews were so much more into washing hands and immersing themselves in clean bodies of water that they were hygienically more resistant to this type of plague. That may be true. That's a fringe benefit. It's always good to do the right thing because there are always many fringe benefits, but that's not the reason why we keep kosher, because it's healthier. Now, kosher is a very broad category. Even when we talk about food, there are many different categories. We'll go through many of them, not all of them. There is kosher and non-kosher species. What makes an animal, a mammal, kosher? It has to chew its cud and have split hooves. That means the animal has to regurgitate its food, and it also has to have split hooves. What's the symbolism behind it? There are many explanations given, but one of the symbolisms behind it is that when you engage the physical world, which is what eating is all about, you're engaging it in the most internalizing way. You actually take the food inside your system. Whenever you engage the physical world, you always have to think and rethink what your engagement is all about and how it's going to affect you, and whether it's the right engagement and how far you should go. You can't just rush into a relationship with the material world. Whenever you engage the material world, you have to always rethink your approach. When it comes to spiritual matters, don't think so much. Just do it. Just jump into it. But when it comes to physical matters, you should always be careful to judge what your involvement should be. Having split hooves, split feet, is based on the idea that the feet are what touch the ground. Again, the interaction with the ground, with the earth, with the physicality. There should always be a split. There should always be room for light to penetrate. That's how we know that our involvement with the physical world will be safe and secure and not bring us down. Rather, it'll elevate us. What animals are included in that category? Obviously, cows, sheep, goats, giraffe, believe it or not. I think there was someone in Israel not too long ago who was serving giraffe meat. Tastes like chicken.
Need a very tall shelter.
What?
Beer.
Bear is not kosher, no. A deer. Deer is kosher, not beer.
Lamb.
What?
Lamb.
Well, I said lamb. No, rabbit is not kosher. Gazelle, bison, buffalo, yeah, those are all kosher animals, kosher species. Fish have to have fins and scales. Now it's interesting, the Talmud says, if you find a fish, and the fish was cut up already, and it doesn't have any fins, but it has scales, you could eat it. Why? The Talmud says, because there is no such thing as a fish that has scales that doesn't have fins. And the rabbi said this when they only knew of maybe a few hundred species of fish. I mean, they didn't, where they fished? They fished in the Kinneret or in some lakes in Babylonia. These were not people who traveled all over the world and did fishing in the Indian Ocean and all over. To this day, they've never found a fish that has scales that doesn't have fins. What's the symbolism? Fins propel the fish. when it comes to our spiritual lives, we have to keep on moving forward, going upward, never staying in one place. But the danger of movement is that when you come to a new place, you're not secure, and therefore you are vulnerable, and you need the scales. Scales are like what you have in an armor to protect you from new challenges that you're not used to. If you stay in one place, it's very easy to protect yourself because you're very much accustomed to the environment and all the threats that exist, and you could prevent it, you could secure yourself. But when you're going from one level to another, you need extra protection. That's one of the symbolisms. That's not the reason we eat kosher fish, but that's the symbolism behind it. Most species of fish are kosher. I can't give you an exhaustive list, but there are certain fish that are not kosher. Shark, for example, is not kosher. None of sea creatures are kosher. Dolphins and whales are not kosher. Birds and insects. The Torah, let's start with birds. The Torah says only the types of birds that are not kosher. The Torah lists a few dozen species of birds that are not kosher. Most other birds are kosher, but we're not really sure which of those species are. They're translated, but the translations are not guaranteed to be accurate. So since we don't know which birds are kosher and which are not, we only eat birds that have a tradition of being kosher, like chicken, turkey, duck, doves, goose. But not beyond that, we don't eat any other types of birds. What?
Pigeons.
Pigeons. I said I think doves, pigeons, the same family. What?
Cornish game hen.
Cornish
Game hen. It's a chicken.
It's a chicken. A chicken is a chicken. I don't know.
Israel. That's their national bird. No, it's not. It's not kosher.
No, we can't say for sure it's not kosher, but we don't eat any of the birds besides those that we have a tradition. Insects are not kosher except for one insect. Does anyone know which one it is? Locust. There's one species or several species of locust that are kosher. We don't know for sure what species are kosher, so Ashkenazic Jews do not eat locusts, so you don't have to worry here, we're never going to serve you locusts. But Sephardic Jews do have a tradition which grasshoppers are kosher, and they will eat grasshoppers.
Usually just Yemenites.
Just Yemenites? Okay. I haven't checked lately. Okay, now we have a kosher species. We know which. We have a cow. What makes it edible to us? We have to slaughter it. You cannot eat the flesh from a living animal. Actually, it's one of the 7 Noahide commandments that non-Jews are obligated to follow. You can't eat meat without killing the animal. And you'd think, who would want to cut a piece of meat off a living animal and roast it and eat it? I understand that in China they do it. They will take a dog, cut off a leg, treat the dog, and roast it. Do one leg at a time. It sounds disgusting, and it's against one of the 7 Noahide commandments. So, but it also applies to Jews, obviously. That's one of the commandments, that we're not allowed to eat anything that comes from a living animal. The fact that we're allowed to consume milk, even though it comes from a living animal, the Talmud has to establish from the words of the Torah that milk is kosher. If the Torah had not told us that clearly by saying Israel is a land of milk and honey, we wouldn't be allowed to drink milk either. Okay, so now we have an animal that we have to kill. You can't just eat an animal without killing it. But how do you kill it? It's through the process called shchita. Shchita literally does not mean slaughter. Shchita means pulling, because the way you slaughter the animal is you take the knife and you pull the knife across the neck of the animal. And the animal could never feel it, because if you knew how sharp that knife is, actually the shochet, the one who slaughters, has to train for weeks and months to know how to sharpen the knife. That's the most difficult part of the shchita process, sharpening the knife, where not only is it sharper than a razor, it has to be totally smooth. And every shochet will take the knife and slide it across his fingernail, and if he detects the slightest nick, that knife is not kosher, and if he slaughters the animal is not kosher. And he could lose his job. My father was in charge of supervising the shochtim, the slaughterers, and he would come unexpectedly to the slaughterhouse and come to the shochet, give me your knife. And my father would test the sharpness of the knife. If he found the slightest nick, this man was out of a job. It had to be perfect each time. So the reason we do it is not because to spare the pain of the animal. That's not the reason. It just so happens to be the most humane way of killing an animal. If the animal was killed any other way, that animal is called nevela, a carcass, a dead carcass, and it's not kosher. So any other way an animal was killed, we're not allowed to eat. But then there's another part of this thing that makes the animal not kosher called treifa, where the word in Yiddish, treif, which means non-kosher, came from. But really, literally, treifa means an animal that was injured. An animal that was attacked, like by a lamb was attacked by a wolf, and the animal has an internal injury. That animal is called treifa, it's not kosher. And by extension, any type of internal injury, defective lungs, a hole in the lungs, which is the most common type of injury, the animal is not kosher. And one of the things that a ritual slaughter is trained to do is to test the lungs of the animal, the most likely organ to be punctured, to make sure that there's no puncture hole in the lung of the animal. Because animals swallow all sorts of garbage, and sometimes they can get a sharp piece of wood or some piece of metal, and that could puncture the lung. And that's why every animal that's slaughtered had to be inspected. The lungs have to be inspected. Otherwise, we assume the animal might be a treifa, which renders it non-kosher. So now we have an animal that was killed properly. But that doesn't make the meat kosher, because the animal has blood in it, and blood is considered to be the most serious violation of the kosher laws. Blood and chalev, the next thing we'll talk about in a second, it's more serious than even the non-kosher meat itself. So how do we get rid of the blood? The way we do it is by salting the meat. And I'm not going to go through the whole process. We have to rinse the meat, then we salt it with kosher. So you remember, you ever go to a store, they give you a recipe, kosher salt. All salt is kosher. Salt, by definition, can't be non-kosher. It's a mineral, unless they add something to it. So why do they call it kosher salt? Because when you make the meat kosher, to get rid of the blood, you have to do it with salt. But you can't do it with the fine granulated salt, because that's going to just dissolve, and it won't take out the blood. You have to have larger granules of salt, so they call that kosher salt. It's used for koshering of the meat.
You have to soak it first.
Yeah, you have to soak the meat first, and then you salt it, and then you rinse it, and then you have to let the blood drop off. Now, sometimes you'll find you'll buy some meat, and you'll see some red stuff in the meat, and it's kosher meat, and it looks like it still has blood. That's not blood. Once it's salted and all the blood leaves, there's still some juice of the meat that's colored red, but that's halachically considered not to be blood, and you're allowed to eat that.
Is iodine what they add to salt?
No, it has nothing to do with iodine.
No, but would that make it not kosher or anything?
No, I don't think that would have any effect. But I don't think the thick salt, I don't think has iodine in it. Yes?
So like if, I buy Empire Kosher chicken, that means that every single Empire Kosher chicken is slaughtered individually and soaked and salted?
Yes. If they sell it to you, see, in the olden days, you would go to a butcher shop, and the shochet was standing there, and you bought a chicken, and he would slaughter it for you, and then you would take it home, and you would have to do the koshering process yourself. But because of Empire and other companies, they do it for you. They do it on a mass scale. I would like to see the amount of salt that they purchase. Tons and tons of salt. and they do it for you. So when you buy the chicken from Empire or any other reputable kosher company, they already did it.
So that's why it's so expensive, because they're doing all this.
Yeah, well, they have to pay the shochet gets a good salary, because he's not just, usually in a slaughterhouse, the people who do the killing of the animals are getting minimum wage. But the shochet he's considered to have the highest position in the hierarchy of functionaries in the Jewish community. And he gets a good wage. And then you have to have a shochet, you have to have a mashgiach to make sure that the chickens were slaughtered properly. There are no broken bones in the chicken. Sometimes a broken bone can render it non-kosher, because then it means it was a treifa. It had an internal injury that would prove fatal if it wasn't slaughtered. So you have many employees that you don't have in a non-kosher establishment. And then, of course, the salting. And now, when it comes to an animal, a mammal, not a chicken, there's two kinds of fat. In the Hebrew, they have different names. One is called shuman, and one is called chalev. Chalev is forbidden fat, and that has to be removed by an expert. That's usually the butchers are the ones who do it, but it's a skill that most people who can even salt their chicken, but they don't know how to, their meat, but they don't know how to do the removal of the fat. That's in Yiddish. There's a Yiddish word for a treber, to treber the meat, to devein the meat, to remove the forbidden fat, forbidden veins, and also the sciatic nerve in the hind part of the animal. The sciatic nerve is forbidden to consume, and because it's so hard to remove the sciatic nerve and all the other pieces of fat that are forbidden, it's generally accepted in America that we don't use the hind part of the animal. That's why you're not going to get into a kosher butcher shop and get what's the kind of sirloin steaks. Right, those are, but there's nothing wrong with the hind part of the animal per se, as long as it's done right. And I think the Syrian Jews do use the hind part of the animal, and I think in Israel they also have.
In Israel, there's no, in America, what happens with the hind quarter, it goes to the non-kosher trade.
Right.
In Israel, they don't have a non-kosher trade.
Right, so they do use it. But in America, it was generally accepted. I don't know when the rabbis made this up, that we shouldn't use the hind part of the animal, but probably when they realized how difficult it was to remove the forbidden fat and how lax some butchers were, they decided leave out the hind part of the animal. Now, why do we not eat the sciatic nerve? Because when Jacob was wrestling with the angel, he struck him in his thigh and dislocated his thigh bone, the sciatic nerve, and that's why we don't eat it. But there's something deeper. The deeper meaning is that the Jewish people are always going through a struggle with their enemies. Unfortunately, we have to talk about anti-Semitism almost in every class because we're experiencing it firsthand throughout the world. And we have to realize, yes, they could injure us. We are vulnerable, but they can't destroy us. Jacob healed eventually. So by eating kosher meat, you're actually reminding yourself of the Jewish people's vulnerability and at the same time our immortality, that they can't destroy us.
Rabbi, probably should mention the bodek. The shofar doesn't say is.
Oh, yeah, I did mention that there's a special person who checks the meat to see that it was that his lungs were not punctured. That's the job of the bodek. Yes.
This level of kosher food. For somebody it's kosher, for somebody it's not kosher.
Okay, good question. Are there standards? Yes. And in Judaism, there are many standards. There's something that can be called kosher. I'll give you an example. The lungs of the animal that I mentioned before. Sometimes the lungs could have a punctured hole, but there's a scab that grows over it. And there's a question about whether it's still kosher or not. According to some opinions, it's still kosher. According to other opinions, it's not. Ashkenazic Jews follow the lenient opinion that it is kosher. Sephardic Jews follow the stricter opinion. Glatt kosher, what is the word glatt kosher? You probably saw that. Glatt means smooth. There are no scabs on the lungs. It's smooth. Sephardic, Ashkenazic Jews in Europe did not maintain that standard because they couldn't afford. You bought an animal, if the animal turned out to have problems, you wanted to be lenient because otherwise it would be a major loss for you because you couldn't give the animal back. You bought the animal, you slaughtered it, and it turns out to have problems. So you would suffer a major financial loss. So the Jews in poor countries, in Europe in particular, would just go by keeping kosher. And in America also, when the Jews started coming here at the turn of the century, 20th century, they maintained the lower standard of kosher. But then when more Orthodox Jews came over, and especially Hasidic Jews, they wanted to maintain a higher standard to make sure that it's glad kosher. For Sephardic Jews, that's the only kosher. Sephardic Jews are not allowed to eat in the homes of Ashkenazic Jews in some instances because they have more stringent standards in certain areas. But Ashkenazic Jews try to match those standards, and that's why we keep glad kosher. The liver is the one exception to the general rule. How do we kosher the meat? As I said before, by salting it, soaking it, salting it, and rinsing it. But liver, because it's so saturated with blood, you can't do it. The only way you can make liver kosher is by roasting it over an open fire. You put a cut in the liver, you put a little salt on it, and you roast it over an open fire. Then the liver is considered to be kosher. If the liver was cooked, it's not kosher, and the pot is not kosher. You cannot cook liver. Once it's roasted, if it was roasted within 72 hours of the slaughtering of the animal, you could then cook it if you want. Yeah.
When you make it slit, you have to use a separate knife or a disposable knife or something.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's really not kosher to begin with.
Well, if you cut it and it's not hot, it's not a problem because it's not very hard flesh. But it's better to use a separate knife. Now, people think, okay, I'm a vegetarian, I'm a vegan, so everything I'm going to eat is going to be kosher. Not necessarily. The biggest problem with food is actually insects and worms and bugs. And that's why we have to be careful when we eat, let's say, romaine lettuce, which we eat on Passover. It has to be washed thoroughly and inspected. Every leaf has to be inspected because they're saturated with bugs. They're full of bugs. Strawberries could have bugs in them. I'm not trying to ruin anyone's appetite. But almost every vegetable, almost every leafy vegetable in particular, has to be checked. There are whole manuals that tell you how to check it, how to rinse it, and it's not easy. So if you're a vegan, you still have to worry about eating kosher vegetables. Arla, this is not a big problem. Arla is the first 3 years that a tree bears fruit. You're not allowed to eat that fruit. This law applies mainly in Israel. If it's outside of Israel, if you know for sure that this is the fruit of the first 3 years, you can't eat it. But the assumption is that if you buy fruit, it's not within the first 3 years because trees don't produce good quality fruit in the first 3 years. Forbidden mixtures. If you plant grain together in a vineyard, what comes out of that is not kosher. That's also not a big problem because very few people plant grains in a vineyard these days. Sabbatical year produce. You buy food from. You want to support Israel financially, so you make sure to buy Israeli food. Big problem for 2 reasons. Number one, if it's during a sabbatical year or right after the sabbatical year, there's a big problem because that food, if it's from the sabbatical year, has certain restrictions on it, and therefore it's better not to buy it unless there's a rabbinical supervision that tells you this is not from sabbatical year produce. Also in Israel, I know someone who said, I went to Israel and I was very careful about keeping kosher. I only went to buy fruits and vegetables in fruit and vegetable stores because I wouldn't want to go to a restaurant which had meat. No, fruits and vegetable stores in Israel have to have rabbinic supervision because every bit of produce in Israel has to be tithed. You have to separate a certain amount and burn. Otherwise, the rest of the produce is forbidden to eat. So every place that you go in Israel to buy produce has to be under rabbinic supervision, just like you would go into a place that serves meat. Wine has to be kosher. Wine has to be manufactured in a plant where the operation is performed by a conscientious Jewish person, a mashgiach, we call them. The word mashgiach means supervisor. Otherwise, that wine is not kosher. Chadash.
What is different? Excuse me.
It has to be.
About wine.
It's not different from non-kosher wine. It's the exact same wine, but it has to be manufactured by conscientious Jews who observe the commandments, who are there in the process of making the wine. They push the buttons and they make sure that the non-Jewish workers are not involved in the process. That's what makes the wine kosher. The ingredients could also be a problem. I don't know what ingredients they put in wine besides grape juice. What? But I assume there could be a problem with the ingredients, so the ingredients have to make sure that they are kosher. Chadash is new grain. Anytime we buy grain in Israel in particular, and outside of Israel there are different opinions, but anytime you buy grain in Israel, any food that has grain in it, you have to make sure that it's from the last year's season. It's not new grain. You have to wait until the second day of Passover in order to eat it. We don't have time to go into more depths, but that's why you'll see in a lot of kosher products that'll tell you that this is yashan. Yashan means old. It's grain that had already passed through the second day of Passover. During Passover itself, what's not kosher? Chametz, anything that has leavening in it, any grain that was not guarded specifically for Passover. Now, you have pots and pans. When let's say you cook non-kosher food in your pots and pans, your silverware, your plates, there are ways of koshering much of what you use for food implements. You can kosher your silverware, you can kosher your pots and pans. Plates is a problem if they're china. But all the other things, there's a way of making things kosher. Generally speaking, the way you make something kosher, and I'm just giving you the general outline, let's say you have a pot. You take the pot, you fill it with water, cold water, you boil it, and then you take something like a key or a stone and put it on the fire, and then pick it up, not with your bare hands, of course, and drop it into the water, and the water will just boil over. That koshers the pot. You have to wait 24 hours after using it before you can do that. Then you rinse the pot with cold water, and the pot is now kosher. In the olden days, and even today, we have people who still do that before Passover. They can't afford to buy new pots and pans and silverware for Passover, so they will have it. There are actually places where they have a communal service. They kosher the pots and pans for people. What happens if non-kosher gets mixed up with kosher? You have to consult your local rabbi. It depends on how much got mixed up. It depends the condition of the pots and pans, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of variables. That's one of the subjects that rabbis have to learn before they're ordained as rabbis, the laws of kashrut. Any questions? Did I talk about milk and meat? Oh, I left out milk and meat. How could I leave that out? One of the things that's forbidden is mixing milk and meat. So cheeseburger, by definition, is not kosher. And although the meat is usually not kosher anyhow, and the cheese is probably not kosher, so it's a double whammy.
I mean, people take kosher meat.
But if you take kosher meat and kosher cheese, you can't put them together. If a little milk falls into your soup, you have a problem. When we eat dairy, you can eat meat right afterwards, although the custom is to wait, according to some, a half hour, or some people wait an hour, preferably, between dairy and meat. But after eating meat, you have to wait 6 hours before you eat dairy. German Jews' custom is to wait 3 hours.
They digest faster.
Their food digests faster. What? What?
Dutch Jews as well.
Dutch Jews do 1 hour, yes. but most Jews do wait 6 hours between meat and dairy. What's the reason why we don't mix milk and meat? Again, the main reason is because God said so. It's a form of discipline and making us holy. But it also has a message that God doesn't want us to take different species and mess around with them. That's why we're not allowed to plant grain in a vineyard. We're not allowed to graft different trees one to the other. That we're not allowed to wear wool and linen in the same garment. These are all directed, according to Rabbeinu B'chai, one of the medieval commentators of the Torah, to tell us that we're not in control of nature. Yes, God allows us to deal with nature, to manipulate nature to a certain extent, but there are limits, and not eating milk and meat is one of those limits. Another reason given for not eating milk and meat is because the Torah uses the example of cooking a kid in the milk of its mother. That means that the pagans used to take a young animal and not only kill it, but cook it in the milk of its mother. That's a symbol of cruelty. And to distance us from cruelty, we're told don't eat any mixture of milk and meat whatsoever. And the third reason given is because Maimonides gives this reason actually, that the people in those days, in biblical times, who would worship idols would cook a kid in the milk of its mother as a way of worshiping their idol and serving their idol. So it was a way of distancing us from idol worship. The Torah says, keep away from milk and meat. You can't eat it. You can't feed it to your dog. You can't sell it. You have to get rid of it. You cannot benefit from it in any way. In addition to that, you can't cook it. Let's say you get a job in a restaurant and you have to cook milk and meat. You can't cook milk and meat, because there's a prohibition against cooking it as well. So the three prohibitions: you can't eat it, you can't derive benefit from it, and you can't cook it. Yes?
What about chopped liver? I know you said liver, but...
If the liver was roasted properly, then you make chopped liver out of it. That's all right. You could eat it whole, you could eat it chopped up. You could mix it with onions and eggs. And
I just remember my mother making that. I can't believe she would do it if it wasn't.
She probably roasted it over an open fire.
Okay.
It was already roasted.
Well, now you can get already roasted. I mean, everything is available now in kosher.
Freezer case near you. The tithe, they can't give that to the poor because that was working for the priests. Is that what the...
Right, the tithes that go to the priest, because we're not ritually clean, cannot be eaten, so it's burned.
All right, thank you.
Only small amounts are taken. Okay, no other.
Anybody's interested in kosher in their kitchen?
Right, if anyone wants to kosher their kitchen, we will provide that service. And remember, every meal less non-kosher is a mitzvah.
Especially most of the
Does it say anything in the Talmud about overeating?
Watch your health.
It says in the general statement you're not allowed to harm your health. So, but it's a very subjective thing, because for one person, the question is asked about smoking. Actually, are you allowed to smoke in Judaism? And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was considered to be one of the major authorities of Jewish law, said you can't ban it. And his argument was, although many rabbis disagreed with him, that part of the argument is one cigarette harmful to you? Probably not. What?
They're all harmful.
One cigarette? What are the odds of you getting sick with one cigarette?
Someone who doesn't really smoke and trying it for the first time?
10 cigarettes. I mean, some people will suffer consequences by smoking a lot, someone by smoking less. It's hard to quantify. And if there's a general benefit, and it's a thing that everyone engages in, there's an expression, a biblical expression, God watches over the fools. That if we really think about it, everything we do is risky. There's nothing that we do that isn't risky, but God protects us. That's his argument, but many other rabbis disagreed with him and said, no, you shouldn't smoke. But there's a third position in between, that you should be discouraged from smoking, but you can't call every smoker a sinner. It's easy to label people sinners, and we have enough sins that we don't need additional sins to be labeled sinners. So while we should be discouraged from smoking, it's something that you can't just call everyone who smokes a sinner. And the same thing is true with food. I mean, what food is healthy? It depends who you ask. So you have to use a little common sense and a little self-control, and that's the... Any other questions? Yes?
It's synthesized meat. Is that kosher or is it not?
Okay, the question about synthesized meat is that it comes from stem cells. It comes from the animal. Is that considered meat or not? And many authorities say no, it's not considered meat, and you can eat it with milk. You can have a cheeseburger, synthesized cheeseburger. So it's being discussed by authorities, and as you can imagine, there's no unanimity. And right now it's not practical because I think it's too expensive to produce meat that way, that it makes it affordable to most people. But if you, what do they have, those burgers, those...
Plant-based.
Possible burgers.
Right. They taste like a real burger. There's nothing wrong. They're not healthier, and they're more expensive, so I wouldn't recommend it. Yes?
I was reading or listening to something where they said that the rabbis wouldn't certify like the fake pork.
Right. Now, the reason they wouldn't certify it is because they felt it's gluttonous. I mean, that's all you're missing in your life, to taste the taste of pork. They didn't feel it is kosher, 100% kosher.
But it doesn't look right, right? Like some...
Well, okay, not looking right is another issue. If you go to a wedding and they serve a meat meal and then they give you ice cream for dessert. Now, in the olden days, it says in the Code of Jewish Law that if you are drinking almond milk, you have to put almonds on the table so people will know that this is not real milk. They shouldn't say, oh, he just had meat and now you're drinking milk. But nowadays, that's not practiced. And you go to a wedding and they serve you Coffee Rich or any other creamer because most people don't even use real milk. That's not even done widely anymore because it's obvious that you're not drinking milk. Or the ice cream is parav ice cream. Parav means not milk and not meat. So
it's really not ice cream, right?
Yeah, it all started.
Right, it's not really ice. It looks like ice cream, it tastes like ice cream, but it's not ice cream.
You need some imagination sometimes.
Okay.
With these products that are...
Ice cream doesn't taste like ice cream. Yes.
So, relative to the question about the OU, saying they wouldn't give a shachal in a product with his hand, right? On the other hand, Empire, which has an OU, has turkey bacon. So it seems to me that
it's not consistent. I don't know what's...
And not only that, I think there's a vegan, we talked about a contradiction in terms, there's a vegan butcher shop in Rochester. They butchering. So I wanted to actually change the name because, it's a contradiction in terms of vegan butcher shop. But they have bacon, they have ham and everything else. And I think it's either is or it's going to be under the Star K. So, I mean, you can buy all these things. And certainly for years, they had fake crab meat and everything else.
Right. I guess the OU is...
a supermarket in Toronto, and it was like an entire...
right, so I assume that the OU, it's an extra legal point. They didn't feel it was right, and even though in the past they did put their seal of approval, they felt it's going too far, and people are just trying to indulge, and why should we make it easy for them to do that? But halachically, there's no reason to distinguish between fake shrimp or fake...
It's being squeamish.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the fake crab, it said Shirini, so it didn't say what it actually was.
Now, nowadays, how do we know something is kosher or a product is kosher? We're fortunate. there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is, unlike Europe, there are organizations that certify products. So that you look for an OU or an OK or a Chav K or a Star K or a BVK, it's a local service. These are organizations, reputable organizations, that oversee the manufacturing of these products, and they claim that these products are kosher. That's the good news. The bad news is there are so many organizations that we don't always know which ones are reliable, which ones are not. There are ones that are definitely not reliable. For example, the Triangle K is notoriously not reliable. Although I know the rabbi who supervises it, who's a brilliant scholar, and his argument, I think, is, I never spoke to him about it, but his argument is that it's a company that we couldn't really make it 100% kosher, so it's 90% or 80%, and Jews who are very conscientious won't buy it anyhow, so I'm doing it for those Jews who would buy it, so at least they should have some standard of kosher. I don't know. It's a little strange, but it's generally accepted that Triangle K, I'm putting this on the internet, so I'm allegedly has problems. I can't vouch for it.
What about plain K?
If you just see a K on a product, that means nothing. Anyone could put a K on a product as long as you claim that it's kosher. You can put the K there. Doesn't mean that there's any rabbi supervising it. You know the story of the Jew who goes into he takes a vacation to another city, and he goes into this non-kosher restaurant and orders non-kosher food, and the rabbi happened to have been in that city as well, and he passes by and he's looking inside and he's seeing this man digging into this non-kosher meat, and he's flabbergasted. This is one of his respected members, is not eating kosher, so he confronts him and he says, I saw what you were doing. He says, what do you mean? What was I doing? He says, you were eating non-kosher. What are you talking about? Did you see me eat? Yeah. So I was eating under rabbinic supervision.
Very good.
What?
Sprouts.
Sprouts?
Yeah.
I don't see any problem with sprouts. Could they have bugs in them? I don't know. I don't think so.
Everything could have bugs.
Everything.
Salad spinner.
Even my computer has bugs. Okay, any questions on Zoom? No, okay, everyone have a good week. God willing, next week, 11 o'clock, on Sunday, we'll be doing the story of Maimonides. Wednesday, lunch and learn.
The chicken much more
See, if you wanted to make your dishes and stuff kosher, you would bring it to the mikvah, and they have a separate thing over there where it makes your pots and pans kosher.
The mikvah is not to make it kosher. The mikvah is an added-on thing. To make it kosher, you have to boil the pots and pans and the silverware.
It's a little confusing because I know when I was taking your class, we went over to your mikvah, and there was a separate small thing where they were putting their
that's after you make it kosher. You then have to immerse it in the mikvah. I didn't get into that, but that's a separate.
When is he going to mention that? Because that was kind of important.
Okay, you should have asked.
What is the question?
About mikvah, immersing it in the mikvah.
Immersing what?
Over your pots and your pans, you brought them over to your mikvah, and there was something where you ran the rainwater to make it kosher.
Yeah. The special mikveh for utensils.
Outside, right?
Okay. And so when you said you want the Jewish family to eat kosher, and I was thinking, who really decides what's kosher?
The Jewish law decides what's kosher.
Jewish law. So when they're brought up, the Jewish to teach you the Jewish law, then they know what is kosher.
Right. That's what rabbis are are trained to know what makes something kosher, what doesn't. Everyone can learn that, but the rabbi is supposed to be the expert in that.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay, you're welcome.
In fact, that had changed from being a two-way street to one way, because everybody goes. So, he's looking around, the head cover.
What's the Rosh Tevis from Kosher? Was der Blebi gerade gesagt?
What?
The Rosh Tevis from Kosher.
Kamaitzi Shalom.
Kamaitzi Shalom.